My name is Tim Luecke, the co-founder of Transatlantica. Welcome to the second installment of our discussion forum. Today with me again, Anthony Pahnke and Jason Tang. Anthony is based in San Francisco, Jason in New York. And today we're going to discuss Jason's article entitled "Condemned to be Free: 4 Dilemmas in the Future of Germany." So the article is basically taking a closer look at the long-term economic prospects of Germany, and Jason is laying out 4 dilemmas that he's going to explain a bit in a minute. I briefly want to say a couple of words about the forum and the Kable. So the Kable, which is our online magazine, is where Jason's article was published. And the forum, again, is our online discussion platform. And the idea of both is that they are, in the long run, are going to help strengthen democracy and democratic participation. The Kable is supposed to do this by discussing and publishing articles that discuss issues that are maybe not getting the attention in the mainstream media that we think they deserve, or that will discuss issues that we think are not getting sufficient attention. And the forum is supposed to provide a possibility for us to discuss these articles or other topics of interest, and also to give our readers an opportunity to raise questions, criticism, and the like. And what I think is great, I mean, we're still in the very early stages, so most of the people who are going to watch this video, we would consider you probably our early adopters. So if you have any feedback on how to improve this format, let us know. But what I wanted to point out today is that it seems to be working. And this is, I think, some rather fantastic news. It's very exciting for us, obviously at Transatlantica. But we're getting more and more responses and feedback and critical responses as well from readers and people who watch our videos, the shorter ones, the longer ones, different formats. And what we are going to do from here on out is we want to increasingly respond to those feedback or comments as well, because this is the idea in the long run, right? That we have an actual debate. We might not be sitting at the same table, at the kitchen table, as they like to say, but we actually do hear your comments, we do hear your feedback, your criticism, and we're taking it seriously, and we're going to respond to it as well. And today we're going to do this for the first time in a very explicit manner, because we got some excellent feedback from Peter Bach, who's living here in Cologne, and he had some feedback to Jason's article, and we're going to address that later on. But first, let me start with some brief preliminary comments. There probably couldn't be a better time for an article like "Condemned to be Free" to be published. We just had 2 state elections here in East Germany, both resulted in very significant gains for the AfD, the right-wing populist party, but also for the party of Sarah Wagenknecht, who one might situate on the left populist side of things. So things are very, very precarious right now in Germany. And at the same time, the economic situation in Germany is also not very rosy, right? We just got some very bad sort of news about that the number of bankruptcies has increased by 25% compared to the last quarter. That's from the Federal Office of Statistics. Volkswagen, big car manufacturer, is in trouble. Intel wanted to build a huge factory here in Germany, and they just canceled those plans. So things don't look really promising. And Jason's article Jason makes the argument in his article that a lot of the gains also for those fringe parties or extremist parties on both sides of the political spectrum are due to economic causes. What makes the article interesting, though, in my opinion, or most interesting, is that he's taking the long-term view rather than the short-term view. So with those comments in place, Jason, maybe you can sort of run us through the article briefly, explain the sort of 4 dilemmas, and then we'll just go with it.
Yeah, sure. Is my mic working okay? Just doing a quick check. But yeah, I mean, yep. So basically the idea I wanted to focus on kind of was this concept of like what Germany faces aren't necessarily problems per se, but dilemmas. And I kind of make the distinction that like a problem is basically something that is a simple solution. For instance, like I'm hungry, I'm just gonna go buy a sandwich. Dilemma is more like I have like $100. I can either pay rent or I can get food for the week. Right. So you have a bunch of just really kind of like bad options. And I think one of the issues that Germany's facing is that it's facing like 4 fairly large dilemmas that are all hitting at the same time. And just to give the quick rundown of like the 4 dilemmas, the first one is sort of like the green transition. Germany has, I think, admirably decided to go like, we're gonna commit to the green transition. It's been largely unilateral, and they're doing it without nuclear. And frankly, like Germany's not a great place for solar. It's just basically a huge cost for their industry, which is again problematic because one is like you are intentionally basically just crippling your efficiency and productivity. There may be a long-term payoff, but in sort of like the short and medium term, you're going to have an issue there. The second issue they're facing, or dilemma they're facing, is demographics. Germany, as I think, is well below replacement rate. I think last I checked, it was like 1.6-ish children per family. And it's likely to decline going forward. There's a couple of solutions to this problem. One is immigration, but that's obviously politically kind of problematic. And there's also sort of like nativity proposals, but like I don't necessarily know that like there's any kind of evidence that has worked at any kind of scale. Like there was one exception. I may get into it later if it comes up, but the issue then is that you just have too many old people, not enough young people. And the third issue is I guess what George Will termed as a holiday from history in reference to like the 9/11 attacks. But basically the idea is that like we are no longer moving away from this kind of like, I think it was Joseph and I pointed like, basically it's a soft power world, right? There's a land war in Europe. Great power conflict is rising up again between America and China. Like there's instability all across the Middle East and even in South America. Like it's no longer the case where basically like countries can afford to basically cash in on that peace dividend. And Germany is going to have, or at least like Germany is in the process of relearning whether or not it chooses to go down that path, as Mr. Pahnke kind of argues against. But like whether Germany chooses to go down that path or not, I mean, it's still going to have to learn how to do a bunch of things. And finally, it's sort of like the economic model, which you touched on. Like basically, I mean, to kind of grossly oversimplify, the German economic model over the past, say, 2 or 3 decades was kind of based on cheap Russian energy, American peace dividend, and exporting to China. All 3 of those are kind of facing issues right now. And as an export-driven sort of economy, it's not clear to me like what there are a bunch of solutions. All of them are probably, there's going to be losers in any kind of ultimate solution, and how Germany chooses to navigate that is a question, because like Germany obviously is a democratic society. And that brings with its own kind of like, it's not in the case where it's like, like Russia or China where, I mean, even though they're constituencies, but like obviously Xi Jinping and like Vladimir Putin have significantly more control over the direction of what happens. In Germany, like, I mean, yeah, you have to form some sort of consensus. And you mentioned like the rise of both the far right and the far left. Like, it seems to be like the European like approach to these more fringe parties is to basically say, okay, we're just not going to talk to them. And I think maybe that works when they're like 1 or 2% of the vote, right? But what happens when you get into a situation like Geert Wilder, I think, yeah, or like, yeah, even now the AfD, like, I mean, when they start coming like 20, 30% of the vote, then you run into the problem of like, how democratic is it to just ignore them? But that's a separate, like, there's that's been a problem of democracy for basically, I mean, that's why they didn't think it would work. And to be clear, I wanted to end on like a more optimistic note in terms of like, there are a bunch of problems facing Germany or dilemmas facing Germany, but like Germany also has like a bunch of very, very strong assets, right? It has a highly educated workforce. It still has significant fiscal capacity. It's still an innovative and productive economy. Like, but how Germany chooses to tackle these issues, I mean, I think there probably needs to be some sort of broad-based consensus, because if it just kind of keeps muddling through, then I think eventually some of these decisions will be made for it. And that, I mean, maybe it works out well, but like I suspect it will not. And that,
wow, thank you. Yes, that was a really good rundown of the argument. And for anyone who's watching it, you can also still read the whole article for free at transatlantica.substack.com. Anthony, I have a bunch of questions. How do you want to do it? Do you have something you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have some questions and comments, but I also have some general overarching things. I guess one thing is some of the issues that you allude to. I'm curious, how much are they uniquely German versus just advanced capitalist states? Like demographic problems, that's I think fair across. Many countries have that. Then you have you're talking about essentially climate change. What do we do with climate change? And that's everybody's worried about that.
Right.
And I was just Tim, do you want to jump in?
Oh, you mute.
Yeah, no, I think this is yes, we're just going to jump in more. We're so disciplined at first. Yes, Jason, you actually make that point, right? That the green, I would say with the climate change issue, the one thing where Germany really is different is the nuclear option.
Yes.
Right. So in the US, it's kind of like the new thing to explore mini reactors and things like that. And that's something that's just a total no-go in Germany for actually a historic reason, right? We had Chernobyl. I remember not being able to play on the playground and not being able to go mushroom hunting in the forest anymore. It was super traumatic. So, but yes, a lot of the issues, and this is, I think, what makes the article fantastic. It brings up a lot of issues that concern both sides of the Atlantic and the world in general. Right?
I would say that definitely Germany, it's not unique to Germany. I mean, each country has like a unique concoction of like terms like where they are in terms of the scale. Like, I think, for instance, the demographic problem, Germany is not Japan or even Korea or even China. Like, and it can look at that for examples. The problem is like we don't really have a lot of great examples of like how to deal with like a rapidly aging population or rapidly shrinking population that isn't caused by war, famine, disease, that sort of stuff. Like, yes, the Japanese way is an approach, right? But it's not immediately clear to me that like Germany look at how Japan has handled its last 3 decades and say like that is what we want to do. It seems like we're still trying to do okay, we're trying to crank the birth rates up. Like, for instance, one solution could be to do what China did, right? I think the retirement age in Germany is 67. Is that right? Or something around there. The idea is that you basically just say like, look, like the way retirement traditionally worked is that you retire and you die in a year or two. So I think what the average I don't know what the average like lifespan is in Germany nowadays, but you can say like we're just going to increase the retirement age by a decade. But that obviously has political consequences. You can't just like, even in China, like it's a very, very sensitive topic. Like
That's not gonna fly.
yeah. And like Germany is also becoming like, I mean, like any Western developed economy, like as it ages, it becomes a gerontocracy, right? The old, not only do they have control of the most assets just by dint of like, you know, you've been working your entire life, so you have more assets, but like, you also have the most voting power, right? So I know Aristotle worried about like oligarchy eventually replacing democracy. Maybe, I mean, gerontocracy is in effect a kind of oligarchy.
Very good. I love it.
If I could
Go.
say something,
Yeah,
so I think
go.
another thing, whenever I talk about Germany, or I think about Germany as somewhat different from the United States, the nuclear stuff is interesting. I also think of your businesses are different. I should say the German businesses, like you mentioned some of them in the article. And I just did some research on Merck, and there's a US Merck, you know, the pharmaceutical firm, and then there is the German Merck pharmaceutical firm. And what's interesting is not just that there is this industry, but that you have a way of, at least as when I teach it, is you have a German way of dealing with conflicts. Like you have the system of co-determination, which is totally foreign in the US context. And it is actually, I think, like a model for other countries to follow. And it's slower, maybe more organized, more planned, but it's where you have state and business and unions figuring out policy. Like, and I remember this is I mean, it's just a real story, but and this actually changed recently. But there was Volkswagen came to U.S., invested in Tennessee, I think. They set up a factory, and they said, "Okay, where's your union?" And the workers were like, "We don't want one." And Volkswagen was like, "What?" And so they're like, "What do you mean you don't have a union? Get a union. We need someone to negotiate with." And the workers got together and they had a vote and they voted the union down. And the Volkswagen executives were like, "What are you doing? Like, this is not how you run a business. Like, you people, what the hell is going on?" And I think since then, I want to say pretty recently, there has been a union. The shop has been made union. But the point is, there's a German way of managing your economy that I think it's I think been chipped away. But there is something to that. And I wonder if that speaks to any of these problems that Jason mentions.
Well, I would say quickly that like there's kind of like I would say like there's two broad branches of like the German economy, right? You have like what we consider like traditional German companies like Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank, BASF, right? Those are actually probably less German than they are multinational companies. And the reason I say that is like Deutsche Bank is literally not only too big to fail, it's too big to save. Germany is not big enough to save Deutsche Bank if it runs into trouble. Like Volkswagen is okay shutting down its German factories. It will absolutely not touch its Xinjiang factories. Because Xinjiang is more important to the survival of Volkswagen than, frankly, the German economy is. Because like I always import cars from China. And then there's the other, what I would consider the more backbone part of the German economy, the Landesbanks, the Mittelstand. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Apologies to all the German listeners. But like, these are the companies that are small, family owned. They produce like one thing, one very, very specialized thing that like, you know, like ball bearings or like precision screws or something like that. They produce one very small thing, but they are literally world beaters. And there's kind of like, there's been this kind of gap in the economy where it's like, I would say like the Volkswagens of the world have all the power. At least in the political system, it seems like. And these Mittelstands, like, they're too small. They lack access to capital. Because Volkswagen can tap the capital markets. They can tap the European or the US markets for capital. Whereas the Mittelstands are largely limited to bank loans within the German economy. And the Landesbank were very, very badly hurt in 2008 during the financial crisis. And it's just limited, right? They're having issues hiring and doing all that sort of stuff. And my concern more is that like those companies are the ones that are withering. Because Volkswagen will be fine, right? Even if Germany just decides like we're going to completely deindustrialize, Volkswagen will be fine. They will just move to America. They will move to China. And that I think is it's harder because it's like you don't know about a lot of these companies, but they're vitally important to both the global economy and the German economy in aggregate.
Yes, so the Mittelstand, and your pronunciation was pretty good actually, so don't worry, is traditionally seen as the backbone of the German economy. And I was recently at a conference called the NRW USA Summit, where this was the topic of conversation as well. And all the points you mentioned, Jason, are absolutely correct. I mean, even I wasn't aware that a lot of these companies are actually quite sizable. So they go up to a couple hundred million sometimes in terms of total revenue, but there is still obviously not Volkswagen, and that those are the companies that we always hear about. It's kind of also maybe that we're trying to Americanize everything. It's like the big companies, and they dominate everything, and then but I think what it points to is the actual real problem in that goes through your entire article. I have a couple of questions, but I think this is the big one, and it's one that Peter Bach actually called the fifth dilemma. And this is sort of the question of how to make decisions, and how, well, you already said that they don't maybe have as much lobbying power as Volkswagen or something. They don't have as much like visibility. Lufthansa got a huge $9 billion loan during COVID, which they paid back. But that was because, yes, Germany cannot exist without Lufthansa. So those for the German economy, and there are benefits, and you mentioned that, and people at the summit mentioned that as well, that actually a lot of governors in the United States would love to have like Mittelstand companies invest in the US or open up branches there, and that the model in general is very attractive for various reasons. But yes, the real problem is how to make decisions and how to create the conditions that make it possible for those companies to continue to operate successfully into the future. And that's where the rubber meets the road, I would say, right? So why, because, wait, last point on that, because what's the definition again, Anthony, that one here, the political scientists, graduate school of politics, who gets what, when, and
But how?
and how, or something?
Yeah.
I always forget.
Yeah.
So those are basically the questions that politics is dealing with, and the dilemmas in essence are basically just questions of political decisions. Somebody's going to lose, somebody's going to win, and just a decision has to be made. And this seems to be something. Maybe people in the US can do that too, but Germany seems to, as you say, maybe be the world champion in the modeling through area. So want to say a couple of words about that.
I mean, it's fundamentally like one of parts of the time frame issue in terms of like the losers are almost. I mean, the losses happen immediately. The benefits don't come until way till you're out of office. And this isn't like again. This isn't even like a democracy issue, right? China's been talking about moving towards like consumption-led growth for literally decades now, and it still hasn't been done. It's because it's hard, right? Like you have entrenched interests, like, and there needs to be some sort of consensus. Usually, honestly, like in a democracy, it takes some sort of crisis, right? It takes some sort of realization that like everybody's realizing that like, okay, this is really awful. We need to do something, right? If it's been kind of like a slow grind, right? You know that old, the old like analogy of like a frog boiling in its soup or whatever. Like honestly probably needs to get worse before the stakeholders, basically before everyone kind of says like, okay, we're willing to make the sacrifice, right? That's why war is so transformative. It's why war allows the impossible to be possible, right? How do you draft like 1 million people to fight in your war? Well, or to basically give their lives up to the government. You have a war. And hopefully it doesn't get to that.
We solved this without a war.
Yeah,
we are in crisis, right? I mean, everybody, if you're here in Germany, it's like nonstop, right? And this is what it's our bread and butter, unfortunately.
It's crisis, right? Like,
I think there's a couple of things here. I was going to jump in because I think one thing to recognize, or one thing to think about, taking a step back. One is we're having this conversation, and Germany can have this conversation, particularly because it is on top of a hierarchy. It's not compare it maybe to Japan, but Kenya or Brazil or other countries in the global south, they have different issues, but climate change is global. Demographic issues are not the same in terms of age, or rather it's the opposite. Like there's too many young people, and that poses a whole nother set of problems. But the power you have in the international system, like Germany is a major player, and maybe there's changes in its some changes, but it's not like, oh my gosh, Germany now is going to become a country like in the global south. That's not happening. There's a certain I don't know if I would say privilege, but there is like a hierarchy here that Germany sits on top of, and Germany has this capacity to muddle and to ponder these things when a lot of countries are the takers of what other countries like Germany do.
I would say like the thing is like I would be kind of careful about that, because one thing is like there is like I don't know if I mentioned this in the article, I don't think I did, but like there's this tyranny of compound interest, right? Einstein talked about it, the most powerful force in the world. One way to put it in perspective is that like if the United States had grown 1% per annum less per year since 1980, our GDP per capita would be about equivalent to Mexico right now. And like you see it now in Germany. In 2008, like the average German median income would have put it in the top 3 states. We're talking like Massachusetts, California, New York, right? If Germany were to enter the United States Union now, it would be somewhere around where Mississippi is.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Really?
A median income, like Germany would be roughly around where Mississippi, France would be around where Arkansas is. In 2008, again, you would be in sort of like the richest countries, richest states in the United States as well. Like, so like, you are like, I mean, like, yes, Germany is.
I don't know if that's a fair comparison. I don't know if that works.
Yeah, it doesn't.
No,
it's not obviously not an
doesn't work because income. I think particularly in Europe, you have countries that have significantly better social services.
Right.
Like I have friends in France who are poor, and they're like, I would never live in the United States, given that I have universal health care. I don't know. That's one thing I don't know.
That's a fair point. Yeah. It's like, but in terms of like the issues is like you have to pay for this at some point. And that's where that eventually, again, it's not going to be an issue now. It probably won't be an issue for another 10, 20 years. Right. But like at some point down the line, like you're going to have an issue with the demographics coming where you have like 2 or 3 working people for every 1 retiree. And I don't know how the United States also is going to face the same issue. Every country is facing this issue. Like, I don't know how you square this issue.
I also just want to throw in that your point is definitely well taken, Anthony, and I think Jason actually, due to his also button clicking job, is well aware of the disparities, global disparities. But I think the issue, and especially if we're thinking about how these economic factors impact politics and political outcomes, the issue is the relative decline that people experience in their lifetime, obviously, right? So yes, of course, we're not like Kenya, and that's a real issue that needs to be addressed too. And actually, we'll get to in some way with Peter Buff's comments later. But the question obviously is, if we're thinking about how does economics impact the way people are voting, maybe even, and that's a tricky causal chain to establish. But then the question is like, what kind of prospects do they have? What kind of expectations did they have? How did those expectations fare? And it doesn't, I mean, from my perspective, I think the outlook in the United States is better than in Germany right now. That would be my subjective, non-professional, non-expert view. If I don't know.
Yeah, I guess my bias would be probably to agree with that. Like, I mean, largely like because, well, I mean, partially because like the EU's in a weird space, like, and the fact is like Germany is again like an export-driven economy that's reliant on a bunch of factors that are out of its control.
I would say I think the press agrees with you, Tim. It's like I've bet in the news I've heard people say we're in an election cycle in the United States right now, and Trump keeps saying America's going to hell. And a lot of people in the press, left-leaning press, says honestly, compare the U.S. economy to most of Europe, and the U.S. is doing better. You know, so I think people in the, at least in the common sense kind of say that, like, they agree with you. They say, like, things are not perfect, but compared to other countries, economically, the U.S. is outperforming most other places in the world. And I was going to add what you were saying, Tim, too, about, I remember after the 2008 crisis, I forget where this came from, but they talked about this elephant curve where essentially since 1980 to 2010 or something, there was this graph showing income growth. And essentially it shows like an elephant, like the hump of an elephant, like its back. And those represent poor countries. Like those countries, like essentially, I should say extreme poor people in poor countries, like in China and stuff, like their incomes just shot up. And then in the middle income and then high income countries, you have this downward trend, or rather stagnation, where basically people's income has not changed, particularly in the United States and in Europe. Like middle income people, and then that haven't changed. And then high income people around the world, but particularly in the United States and in Europe, had just shot up. And that issue of the economics, the idea is like from 1980, like a ton of people, millions of people, I should say, in Europe, United States, have seen no advancement. They're still better than most people living in poverty in other countries, but they have not seen, so they're stagnant. And that's their world. And then they see immigrants, they see other people changing, and they get mad. So that's one thing, just to comment.
Yeah, I would just say, like, I mean, this goes into more sort of like the ideas, like, yes, we talk about free trade and whatnot, and like that kind of gets into sort of the plumbing, which I don't know if we want to get into this specific podcast. But like, I mean, functionally, like, it turns out like one of the core assumptions of like, you know, basically free trade being good for everyone. That's true if we have balanced free trade. It doesn't work if you have countries running extended surpluses or deficits, a la the United States / whatever. But like, yeah. If we look at Germany, I mean, again, I'm not an expert of reunification, but like the thing is, like, we don't really have a lot of models. I mean, we basically have what Reconstruction, maybe in the American South, and that was like obviously that's barely comparable. But like, I mean, at the time, Germany made two, I think, like maybe economically questionable, but like political decisions that I think were very, very important. Like that kind of may be set kind of frame for where we are. One is that like when East and West Germany reunited, you basically allowed East Germans to move to West Germany and vice versa. Right. That was just like, I mean, like, okay. The second thing you did was, if I remember correctly, you pegged like the Deutschmarks. You basically had a 1-to-1 transfer. Like, I'm sorry, what did you say, Tim? Sorry, you muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, I'm
not
sure.
It wasn't 1-to-1, but it was definitely not like, because the thing is, like, East Germany was significantly less educated, significantly less productive at the time. And the peg basically you basically artificially strengthened their currency massively, which ended up destroying their industrial base. And anybody with kind of like the skills and the talent, right, ended up moving from East Germany to West Germany anyways. So you ended up like, again, like politically, like you had to do it, right? There's no way you could just be like, okay, East Germans, you gotta stay there until you catch up. But like politically it had to be done, but economically, like, again, like you're kind of, I think maybe you're seeing the reverberations of like those decisions. And that's the thing.
Yes. I mean, there's also the other story that we heard from when we did interviews with people in East Germany and more recently even, and that's also just common knowledge amongst people who kind of care about the history, is that a lot of West German, like, let's call it talent, moved to East Germany and basically grabbed top positions, either became professors or took over companies or run the thing. They basically bought entire complexes, companies, and basically stripped everything, made a ton of money, and then just left.
I mean, yeah, Reconstruction again, like, yeah, like that was, I mean, that's the only analogy. I'm sure there's other ones, but that's the one I can think of that like seems to be like a rough proxy. Like it's like.
So no, this is interesting because obviously this is a huge debate right now in Germany, and there's basically two arguments. There's one which is that people in the East are more likely to vote for AfD and left and BSV because they had not as long of a history of democratization, basically, and that during the East German times, when they were in the communist sphere, no one really educated them about the crimes committed during the Nazi past. That's the one argument. And then there's the more economic argument, right? That basically people were promised, they called it flowering land, can't translate it right now. Blühende Landschaften. Flowers everywhere, beautiful landscapes everywhere. And so expectations were obviously very high, and then they were disappointed. It's kind of like the Obama effect. Expectations are very high. They had to be sort of disappointed because they were way too high. Yeah. And then you see that things didn't turn out, and so the frustration manifests itself in those voting results. So we actually have another long 20-page interview with a German historian who makes the historical case. So it's kind of neat that we're doing this part. But yes, I want to come back to the political decision problem. But first, I wanted to ask you, what would you do with the four dilemmas? Let's assume for a moment you are making the decision and you are guaranteed re-election. What would you do with the green transition?
The green transition, I think I would go nuclear. Because like Germany is not naturally suited for solar, obviously. Like it's not southern Spain. Like you're making a huge bet on hydrogen. Like, and if it pays off, that's going to be great. If it doesn't pay off, you basically have like you sunk several $1 billion in very, very expensive, high maintenance natural gas facilities. So like, you have a fundamental issue in terms of like, it's going to cost a lot of, I mean, because the thing about most renewable sort of energy supplies is that they're very capital intensive upfront, right? In terms of like, you have to pay a lot to get solar panels installed and everything else like that. But you don't, once it's installed, you're kind of like, the costs are kind of evaporated. Unlike say like a coal power plant or like even like a natural gas power plant where you're, the cost of facility is there, but like most of the cost is basically from the supply. So you have an issue of like, okay, I need to get all this capital to kind of dump into this sort of green transition. There are, you want to ask the question, and I think, I'm not sure, like, my intuition is that like, if I'm hell-bent on optimizing on just like the green transition, I basically say, you know what, like, I agree with Draghi. I say basically like, the solar panel industry is lost. Europe cannot compete, it can never compete. We're basically just going to buy from the Americans and the Chinese. Like, we just don't have any, batteries are probably going to lose that too. So we're just going to bring it in from China. We're just going to seed like, seed that technology China to complete the green transition. If you want to maintain your own green transition, well, that's going to be a lot more expensive, and you're probably going to need to work in concert with the EU, because the German does not have the fiscal capacity and technology by itself, supply chains by itself, to do it. And that's
I have a question.
Go.
So what's I guess part of me, maybe this is a little populist in me, but why not make a list, talk about solar, wind, nuclear, maybe some other option, and have a plebiscite? Let's have people, let's actually make this democratic instead of technocratic.
Yeah.
Have people, then get people on board. Like climate change, I'm not sure about Germany in terms of details, but I mean, you could build some popular movement, build legitimacy around these issues. If you let the elites decide, I mean, that's part of what, you know, we're talking about the right, the rise of the right, but yeah. I wonder if you could try to democratize this process. I mean, leave it open. There's your Habermasian.
Yeah. No,
like, leave it, like, let's make it democratic, make it about process, like not just about let the banksters decide what to do.
No, and that's the right thing to do, I think. Like, I think that's the only way you can get sustainable, like, in a democratic system, right? I think the issue that you're facing is that, like, there's a time constraint, both in terms of, like, climate change probably needs to be tamped down, and also because, like, if it takes, like, you know, 10, 15 years, like, to come to consensus, then you have to implement it. At that point in time, it may already be too late. Like, we've already watched, like, the European solar industry just die. European battery industry is probably going to die too. Like, there's just, at some point in time, like the longer you wait, like the narrower your choices are.
I wouldn't forego democracy for expediency.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, like, but again, that's also another debate, right? Like in terms of like, because that's what Draghi is saying, right? Like we need a bigger Europe to do all the big European things, and like the subtext to that is that like all these European countries doing their own thing, you know, like it's too much of a pain in the ass, right?
I obviously, I'm so glad the name Habermas was at least fell at least once in this discussion. No, but seriously, I'm not even sure if that would work with model. The problem here is obviously that there are very technical issues at stake, right? So you do need, I just did the democracy practice workshop number 3 yesterday, and I told the young women and men from various countries in the world that they should be aware of experts and don't trust experts, and always be aware of scientists like us and experts. But there are issues where it's very technical, right? I don't know right now. Like that was going to be one of my questions now. It's like, where is our energy in Germany coming from right now? Right? We're like, oh, we're not taking Russian gas anymore, and then there's all these people who are like, well, we actually are, because
it's from India.
Yeah, yeah, and India gets its gas from.
Oh, we don't know. I'm sure it's not right.
We don't know.
I'm sure we'll never find out.
But yes, so there are technical issues, and then there are sort of cultural issues that might be completely unrelated to technical questions of feasibility and safety, right? So we just happen to be super averse to nuclear energy because we had really bad experiences with it. So we might actually choose a bad option. It seems like the political elites agree with this, but so I think I wouldn't maybe not have it be done in a straight referendum, but at least maybe sort of that they feel it out a bit. What I am missing in this whole, with all of these issues, is that there is no politician, and I think this would actually be half the solution, as I said in a video recently, who explains people that there are these trade-offs. Who's just like, okay, if you want, you know, we have like floodings in the south and in East Germany right now, really terrible. And this is going to happen more frequently, and it's causing huge like destruction and cost and blah, blah, blah. So if we don't want to do this or have this continue, then we need to do something. And that's pretty obvious, but it's going to cost us. So, you know, and then lay out the options. But people have to, I have the feeling that the political elites are trying, and that's the same in the United States, are trying to tell people constantly, you can have your cake and eat it too. And it's just not true. Right? It's the same, and this would be, I will use this as my segue to the second dilemma, demographics. We know that, and Peter Bach mentioned this in his comments too, pro-natalist policies are not working. We know this. The only basically way to deal with the demographic issue over time is immigration, right? The problem I see in Germany is, well, it's very politicized, and the mainstream parties or center parties are kind of, I don't know, letting themselves be chased by AfD and others. But they're also, it's part of it is also that they're not able to make a very simple argument. There's like, you can differentiate between immigration, people who seek asylum for the reasons that are specified in legal, you know, in the legal framework in that we have here in Germany and in the EU and others. So it's the whole debate is rather, I gotta say it, it's stupid. It's a stupid debate.
I mean,
so and we're not. So this is what's most frustrating to me. Why is it so stupid? Jason, tell me.
I think because I don't know that, like, maybe Germany has thought really hard about it, but like there is this conception of like, you know, what does it mean to be German, right? There is like, I mean, like there's I mean, like, there's conception to be American. America also kind of benefits from the fact that it is, in fact, an artificially created country. Like, I mean, like, it is an American tradition to dump on whatever, like, the most recent batch of immigrants are. You know, Ben Franklin talked a lot of crap about the German immigrants when they came in because he felt they were kind of like lazy and not particularly useful. But like, I don't know, like, cause like I mentioned the article, but there's different models of integration. Yeah. Yeah, we have like, we have like the French model where like everybody's a Frenchman, right? Like, liberty, yeah, equality, fraternity. There's the American model, the melting pot. And like one kind of sensitive subject that I don't see European countries taking that, I don't know, maybe they want to look at it, is like the idea of the guest worker model, similar to how like the UAE does it, or the Gulf states do it, where basically like you are a guest worker. You will never, ever, ever have a chance to be a German citizen. Right, but while you're here, you can work. But like that, I've generally found like in democratic countries is a significant hurdle, and maybe shouldn't be. I don't know, but like that's a discussion Germany needs to have.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the guest worker
Anthony,
system.
I'm sure.
I would not. Yeah, the guest worker system is. I mean, it's like a. I mean, it's almost like. I mean, indentured servitude. I mean, you're bringing a group of people who don't have political rights to take care of other people. I think that's pretty. Problematic. I wonder about like the care economy as something like I think we really need to talk about, like strengthening, and it's may even come down to like commodifying is the word. But I wonder about if we talk about decommodifying insofar as improving state services, providing people decent wages who are care workers, like, and I think that's something that's discussed in the United States. Actually, I think the focus is on children more than it is on elderly people. Because I think the immigration thing too is, if you're relying on immigrants who are not in the guest worker program, you're relying on essentially ebbs and flows. Like you're relying on crises taking place in other places around. That's not a plan, that people will show up from places that have serious problems. So I also wonder, so there's a couple of points, but I wonder also, I have a friend in Germany who says, what's the real problem here? Like, yeah, birth rates go down. Fine. Less people, less growth, less economics. What's the problem? Like, yeah, that's it. Less people. But
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, this dovetails so nicely with Peter Buss' comments. So we'll keep those for 5 minutes from now. But what I do like about Jason's way of framing it is that it makes the options clear, and it makes it clear that the people, and yes, this is not just a decision that elites have to face. It's a decision that people need to make. It makes it clear that there are trade-offs and that there's certain, just that the options are clear. So you can have the guest worker model, and that's ethically very, very questionable.
I mean, to be clear, you can do. I mean, Japan does it, right? Like, so, like, there are ways to do it. Like, I guess I would say, like, more ethically. But like, you just need to be very, very clear upfront and say, like, look, you have no voting rights. You will never have voting rights, right? You will have like labor laws and everything else like that, right? But like, you are not German. You will never be German. That is not how this works.
Right. Well, and we had a wave of guest workers. Those were Turkish people. Yep. In the 60s, and my grandfather was in German politics at the time and was saying like, hey, sorry, those people are living in barracks and it's just inhuman and you cannot do this. He was a conservative, right? Mm-hmm. That's like a very a thing you would not hear probably right now from the Conservative Party, especially since it tries to get votes from AfD people, right? So this is the politics that I'm missing, is that they're the elites who are stepping up and being like, okay, this is the issue. The problem is we have so many old people and somebody's got to pay for their retirement, and we don't have the workers to do that. So that means we need to get people here, invite them, and create conditions that make it attractive to work here. And we need to figure out a system in that it works. And yes, it should not be that we just take people just because they're fleeing like Russian bombs in Aleppo or something. We should try to, that's a whole different issue that I want to dedicate a whole another forum to immigration. I think the problem really is we need to take care of, and there was a good article, I have to say, a good article in the Spiegel today. We have to take care of the push factors for immigration and not worry about the pull factors, and deter people off from coming here by placing police on the border as they do right now. And that's going to be, they're going to do this for 3 months, and then we have the same problem again, right? So that's a whole big, huge can of worms. But again, it's what I'm missing is that, and we cannot have a democratic debate or even referendum about it if elites are not willing to sort of explain the options to people, right? And this is the real issue that I see. Anything else, and there it goes back to what Anthony was saying earlier. We are living in, I mean, at the first democracy practice workshop that I taught, I was like, there were two young men from Ukraine, and I was talking about the crisis of democracy and, you know, the issues that democracy is having. And the one guy was saying like, sorry, when it comes to democracy, there's like no better place on earth than Germany. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to be quiet now. Right. So yes, we're complaining it's first world problems, as they used to call that. But at the same time, I also think it's important that precisely for that reason, we should lead by example and show how it can be done, ideally, and it's really not done in any sort of form. The political. Okay, I went off a little bit here. Why? Okay, let me put it this way, because you say it in the end, and I agree with you, you're right, but you say like, well, if you're a politician and you run for re-election, you basically shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be honest to people and tell them, okay, this is going to suck. There's going to be losers, and some of those losers are going to be you. But I constantly think, wouldn't that exactly give you re-election? Because people know they aren't that stupid. They know we all might like it when people lie to us and tell us the world is better than it is, but we see that it's not true. And I think this is maybe the biggest problem and the biggest reason for why these fringe parties gain so many votes.
Yeah, I just don't know that that's true. I mean, yes, Javier Milei in Argentina, but like you also have Walter Mondale and Reagan, right? Walter Mondale says like, look, deficit's unsustainable. We're gonna have to raise taxes. Reagan says, no, we were not going to raise taxes. Walter Mondale loses by landslide. Reagan raises taxes. Like we like to say like, yes, I want to hear the truth, right? But just like you wouldn't tell your girlfriend or, you know, your boyfriend or whatever, like when they get new hair, you don't say like, oh my God, it's awful. What were you thinking? Right? You don't, I mean, like, it's just not, I mean, like, let's be real. We like being lied to. We know things are bad. We don't want to be told things are bad. Like, I wish it weren't the case, but like, I think that's just how we are. And I think that's how the populace, yeah.
I would say if you're going to have to make,
what do you think?
To build legitimacy, if you're going to ask people to sacrifice, I mean, like you think about rationing and think about World War II and so on. People were asked to ration, they did it. It was a war, but you had to have a leader who really talked to people, like and spoke. You know, so you can. Yeah, I think a campaign slogan. And I think we've seen this transition. You've seen it in Germany too. Like our parties have changed. They've went from mass parties that actually, you know, delivered services to people. And the Democrats in the U.S. used to do this. You know, used to say in Chicago that if you want your garbage picked up, vote Democrat. And the thing was, that's corrupt, but it also shows that the party was involved in the community. And we've moved to the point where parties are just, you know, they work at the margins, they do sound bites, they're not really relating to people. Look at the Harris campaign now. Like the Harris campaign is riding out this wave of enthusiasm, not taking any risks, playing it super safe. That's, I how parties act more now. Like, so to have a leader to actually lead that's a tall order. I don't know have leaders that do that. Maybe in Germany you have some, I don't know, but I haven't seen any in most places. That hate, that's easy.
Yeah.
So
that's how populists work, right? You say like there's one problem that's the cause of all of our problems. We solve this problem, we're done, right? Like everybody knows, even like I've seen even the people who want to vote for populists know that's not true, right? Like, but like it's just easier and simple to say versus saying, okay, well it's complicated. And you also like if you're an elite, you haven't had a good run of things, right? With 2008, we had the COVID crisis. At least in the U.S., we had the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like, I mean, if you're an elite, like, yeah, your reputation is not doing so hot. Like, and so when you have another elite come and say, like, don't worry, this time we're going to get it right. Like, it's kind of, especially like if you're not like, if I'm not safe, if I know nothing about virology, right? Like, why should I immediately assume that the CDC, after they completely botched like the first COVID test, are suddenly on the ball for the monkeypox? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, right? But I have no like method to sort of like test that, see if that's correct. And that's maybe a broader, relationship to like the crisis of elites. But like,
all right, before we get to Peter's comments, I had one other quick question for you. So you said something, Jason, that's basically very frowned upon in Germany. You said that maybe it is time to talk to people at the AfD and the BSW. I agree with you. I think it's kind of a weird, twisted argument, because it's always been said that if you talk to them, you provide them with legitimacy. And we were told that, like, I was in a particular situation that, well, if you go there, then they basically sort of out-argue you. To which I was saying, like, who are they? like debate wizards or something? I mean, if their arguments, on the one hand, people are saying, like, they don't know what they're doing, and I think that's largely true. I don't think they have the magic wand to make it all go away. But if that's the case, then it would make sense to talk to them, because then it would probably come out, right? So, but again, something to say that in Germany is frowned upon, and I think it's actually detrimental. It's actually helping the AfD significantly, right? What do you guys think about that? Because it's kind of similar in the US.
Yeah, I there's a caveat that like I'm kind of removed from. I'm an American, obviously I can't vote in Germany, so it's like it's very easy for me to say, yeah, sure, talk to extremists. What could go wrong? Like I don't have the cultural baggage, I don't have the historical baggage, right? So obviously from that point of view, it doesn't matter. But like, I think this is not a new problem for democracies, right? Like even back, like that's part of the reason why the Brits were not so torn up about losing America, right? Because they're like, well, they're going to do democracy for like, a decade or so. Then you realize like not having a king sucks, and they'll come right back. And that's always been like an issue of like, how do you do democratic representation, right? Because in the United States, we do first past the post, right? Which is, from just like a mathematical point of view, like a really stupid way to do it, right? Because effectively, like if 50.1% of the vote wins, right, you're basically effectively ignoring the other 49%. Is that really democratic? I don't know. Right. And again, like this is an issue that it's constantly why I think there's always it's an experiment. We're always trying to improve and make democracy more representative, right? Is EU representative democracy? I don't know. I don't think so, right? Like the Lisbon Agenda was an attempt to kind of like deal with that. I don't know necessarily that it did. Like my intuition has always been like you have more to gain by talking than not talking, because like once you start like narrowing like sort of like the avenues of sort of political engagement, it just naturally like they'll just veer towards like other more destructive means. But that's, I mean,
what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. One thing I think of is like I don't know if the question's quite. I hear what you're saying, but I mean they are talking. So it's like you can't, if you avoid them. It's the question the situation doesn't quite work out if you ignore them, because this is not an individual. That's the thing. I think with Trump, with all the far right groups, they're not individuals anymore. Like in Europe, particularly back when the 60s, you had, or 50s and 60s, you had people. This guy in Italy who I forget his name now. He's a fascist, and you had these like like straight up like anti-Semitic like leaders individuals though. They were super isolated, and they would talk, but they didn't have a movement really. Now we have movements. Like they have bases, and they have power. So I think and they're talking like, so there has to be some kind of engagement. That's, I think, one thing to recognize. And I think there's this faith that the process will weed things out. I don't know if that'll happen. But I think engagement is necessary. But it's I don't know. So I think, yeah, whether it's on the news, I think there needs to be space to talk about and have decent conversations, that's the other issue, is people are not really listening to other people. It's like, you can have a conversation. I can talk at you and I can tell you my position. You can tell me your position, and I'm not really listening to you. But if we're really having a conversation, I have to actually listen to you. Like, there's an art to facilitation. It's almost like we don't need to have conversations. We need to facilitate and mediate, because we have these deep differences. It's a different, you know what I'm saying? It's like, not quite just, if you have a 1 minute news segment and I present a position, you present a position, and then we're done. That's not a conversation.
Yes. Excellent. This is a perfect segue too. It's also my next workshop next week. If you want to attend it, is called The Problem of Listening, the crisis of listening and reading, actually, that people are no longer, we did echo chambers yesterday. That's obviously one thing, but that's a whole different story. So it's all coming together nicely. So speaking of, we listened and we read it, and we actually are going to respond it. So Peter Bach, again, he is retired, used to be in one of those workers' councils for a big, I think, auto parts maker, but I might be wrong. But he's been engaged sort of in union stuff and the like. So, and he's still engaged in with the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is also kind of an oddball and difficult to sort of classify, especially when it comes to left-right. But he's definitely on the left. So his all three of us read his critique. I translated them. His comments came in two parts. We got some other comments too, but we're going to focus on his now. The main. Does one of you want to present his critique, or should I do it?
Oh no, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, the assumption that's underlying Jason's argument is that the goal is to have economic growth, because that is necessary for all kinds of things that we value. And I think the thrust of Peter Bach's comment is, why do we need to have that growth? Why can't we have an economic model that has negative growth? Because that would sort of take care of the climate change problem. The more growth we have, the more climate issues we have, no matter what we do. Basically, it's be it nuclear or whatnot, there's always going to be a CO2 footprint, so to speak. I always like to say, if you want to like do something against climate change, stop having children, because that's inevitable. And then there's another argument that's more about the holiday from history point, which we haven't addressed yet at all. But let's go to the negative growth. I always, there's a whole literature on that, on negative economic growth. Jason, what's your take on that?
So from a democratic point of view, yes, if the German electorate decides, you know what, we're going to do negative growth, that's fine. But I think there needs to be kind of an awareness of I think the potential cost behind it. And one of the costs is in the abstract, it makes sense, right? If Germany would say Monaco or even Ireland or Canada, right? Maybe not Canada, it's too big, but like if it was Monaco or maybe Palau or some other small city, then yeah, negative growth, like that's fine. It's no big deal, right? You don't have to worry. The problem is like Germany doesn't get to choose its neighbors, and Germany is a large enough and a big enough economy that it has one interest because it's an export driven economy, and two, like it's in a rough neighborhood. And choosing to kind of go like sort of a degrowth, like unilateral degrowth, like one is that like I don't think I don't think you'd be able to do it as part of the EU. I don't think the French would be too keen on joining Germany in that little kind of venture. And I don't think the Baltic states would be either. Like, so there's that issue.
Can you explain the why? Why?
So, okay, from my understanding from his argument is like, we're gonna like deprioritize the military, right? Like, and we're also gonna deprioritize our soft power. We are in effect gonna become like, I think I mentioned before, like, we're gonna be an open air museum. Like we have like, the Black Forest, we have all these fun little castles, like we have our way of life. We're just kind of like go quietly into the night. The problem is like the rest of the world is not. There's a concept called the Red Queen paradox, like from the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland. It's from evolutionary biology, but basically the idea is that I have to run as fast as I can to stay in place. And another way to think about it is like John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary biologist, had this concept of like basically hawks and doves. The idea being that like when a hawk meets another hawk, they'll fight, and they both come out worse. When a hawk meets a dove, he'll fight the dove, and the hawk will gain, and doves just work together. And there's an equilibrium there where you can't just all be doves, or you can't all be hawks. There's sort of equilibrium there. And I think the issue is like if you do it unilaterally, you run the risk of basically become like, I mean, you can ask. There's a reason why China, India, and a lot of the global South have zero interest in being kind of like, I guess like, or so hell-bent on developing their economies. They know what happens when they become pawns in great power conflicts, right? And maybe the new great powers are going to be less bad, right? But like that's a bet.
I think Anthony has something to say about it too, but before I let him get the stage. So, but the argument here seems to be that this is mostly a military, sort of a security question. But I've never really understood why it's problematic just purely from an economic perspective. Basically what you're saying is if people say, okay, we're going to be content with having a little less and not have more and more wealth, then it would work actually? I mean, I just lack
from an economic point of view, okay, so if you have low income and low expenses, no problem, right? You have high income, low expenses, obviously not a problem. High income, high expenses, also not a problem. When you have low income and high expenses, that's where you have a problem. And that's the fundamental issue is like Germany has very, very high expenses. You look at all of Germany's GDP growth over the past quarter or two, it's literally all government spending. That's the only reason your economy is growing or shrinking slowly. All of this stuff costs money, right? Having the welfare state costs money. Even if you get rid of the Bundeswehr, right, completely, we say like, you know what, we're going all pacifists, right? Like you're still an export driven economy. So in one sense, like that's no longer in your control, right? Like you're reliant on like basic revenue from Volkswagen and those big companies in the Mittelstand to export to other places because you don't have the domestic demand for it. That means whether you like it or not, you have to be involved in international politics in one way or the other. And if you say we're going degrowth, we're just going to lose all that. You're going to lose that lever. You obviously won't have the military lever. So you lose any ability to influence the economic side of things, and you're going to shrink the ability to pay for the actual state, your actual welfare state that you kind of want to preserve. I presume that's what you want to preserve, right? If you want to say like, you know what, we're going to raise the retirement age to 70, we're going to get rid of the welfare state. Good luck, everyone. We're just closing up shop. Then that's fine. Then you won't have like that mismatch. The issue is like there will be a period where you're going to have that huge mismatch of like where you're not making any money, and you've told the world basically that you have no intention of ever kind of like paying back or like making back the money you have, but you still have all these huge expenses. And I don't know how I don't think you can square that.
It's interesting. It makes me think of, even though this is totally the opposite, it makes me think of like these delinking arguments from the 50s and 60s, the decolonial, like revolutionary arguments from like the Cuban Revolution. Like we live in this world system, deconnect and liberation is found, even though this is not like I don't think any state. It strikes me as not a very good idea to unilaterally think of degrowth. Like that sounds to be like a disaster. But degrowth itself would have to be international. It'd have to be planned. And that's I think what people are, at least in the degrowth literature, from what I know, that's what they argue. Is like this would have to be a European Union wide thing at least. And it would have to be, it's not, and degrowth is a misnomer, I think. It's not like, let's have a recession. It's like, we need a planned economy and recognize actually that we already have planned economies. But we need to democratize planning, shift our priorities. Right now, Europeans overall import, grain from all over the world, Brazil, really. Like your egg system is dependent on exports from Latin America. Like rethink those dynamics, maybe bring back agriculture. I don't know how you do that. It's another conversation, but think about your economy. Think about what growth means. I mean, like another thing too is that like oftentimes too we should remember that we have periodic economic crises where just thinking about growth on its own has led to, this is maybe the little Marxist in me, but you have contradictions in capitalism and they explode. 2008, you're thinking about growth and letting the financiers do this led to the economy broke down, and you've had this periodically. So, I mean, that's I think part of the question about degrowth is rethinking the priorities in your economy and really seriously think about planning.
Yeah, and again,
you want to respond to that?
Oh no, I just want to say the issue is always going to be getting an international thing. I think even getting EU thing is going to be hard, but like there's zero chance you're going to get China, India, and America to agree to this. They will just tell you to go pound sand. They'll be just like, fine, you want degrowth? That's fine. We're just going to take all your businesses and company. We're not going to think twice about it. And that's just kind of like a reality you're going to have to deal with, right? Like and maybe at some point in time, like after like a global calamity, that'll happen. But like, I just find it like, I think it'd be dangerous to just be like, you know what, we're going to take the first step. I mean, morally, yes, I agree. That's probably like, yeah, it's a very moral thing, an ethical thing. I guess depending on how you want to frame it, it might be an ethical thing to do. But just in the same way, you don't want a pacifist in charge of your Department of Defense. You probably, like there will be costs.
Yes, I mean, Peter says in his comments that he is not necessarily calling for a wholesale sort of deindustrialization, but a selection of smart industrialization with use of energy that is sensible and maybe changing private consumption. But then he also mentions that we should maybe get rid of the electromotorized, basically cars.
But that's the problem you have right now, right? Effectively, is that like all the technologies you want to get into, right? Even Mario Draghi has basically admitted that like Europe has lost the cloud. It has lost, probably is going to lose electric batteries. It's probably going to lose wind turbines, and it's definitely lost solar. Right? Like you have one successful social media platform that nobody wants to talk about because it's very embarrassing. It's OnlyFans. And so like, I think the issue is just like, yes, you would like to be smart industry, sort of like, it's hard to tell what smart industrialization, because we don't know what it is, right? We don't know if it's quantum computers. We don't know if it's AI. We don't know if it's like, like, making rubber ducks. We just don't know. It's hard to know these things in advance, because obviously if we do them in advance, we would do them. And I guess my concern is like, if you're going to go that path, right? Like it strikes me as like, if you get it wrong, right? So let's say, for example, the Germany decides that, you know what, quantum computing is what's going to do it for us. Right? That can be the deindustrialized. We're going to dump the other stuff. We're going to focus on quantum computing, and quantum computing doesn't work out. Right, then you have the worst of both worlds, right? Because you still spend a lot of resources doing it, and you're still mandatorily, degrowthing, or like shrinking your economic base. Like, and again, like this is not like, I mean, this is always going to be a problem, right? Because nobody knows the future.
So the second part of the comments that Peter made was about security, and you brought up that yes, if you're export-driven economy, then you basically security is just a necessary interest of yours, and so Germany needs to deal with the reality that it lives in a realist world, in an anarchical world where we don't have a government. Peter Bach brings up German history, and we actually had a very good discussion after the Zeitenwende speech of Olaf Scholz with the Mershon Center for International Security and Thomas Klein-Brockhoff from the German Marshall Fund. And there was the same, I raised the same concern that, yes, we have had a bad experience with military might, and our neighbors might not be too happy about it either. Right now, it looks though as if this might be the one growth area for the German economy is Rheinmetall and the military industrial complex, as they used to call it in the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is there no way around this?
I mean, there is. Like, again, like there's always an option, right? But like there's always going to be consequences to the decision. Like if Germany decides to do Switzerland, or like we're just going straight pacifist, like I suspect the Baltic states would not be on board, neither would sort of the French. And Poland probably also would. Like, I mean, like there were ramifications. I don't know what the long-term ramifications are, but like I mean, I would look at Japan as another example of a state that's kind of like going through these issues, right? Like on the flip side, you have America and China, who frankly have terrible records of being military powers, right? But we don't care. We're like, and so there's going to be a consequence. There's going to be a cost, right? Yes, you can get rid of Rheinmetall. I don't know, but then how exactly are you going to get people to sort of defend? Again, you're an export-driven economy, right? Like you have issues with immigration. If you see the right to that, like how are you? I mean, because right now you pay people basically, you pay states to keep the immigrants further south so they can't come up north, right? Like, how will you pay for that? How will you guarantee the security for that, right? Because at the end of the day, even if Germany kind of stays stagnant or goes below, like if it all takes me to sort of like increase my salary by 10, 20-fold, by just taking a ship ride over, like I'm still going to take that ship ride.
What's exactly? Could you rephrase the question about the military? Is this like spending on bombs? What's tanks? What's the military? What's the question here with the military?
Are you talking to me or Tim?
Anybody? Yeah, I'm kind of curious of like what's the worry? Is it spending on bombs?
Yeah,
I wonder if. I would say that because like I think like you have countries like Brazil that had Latin America had a bunch of countries that had just awful military governments, and Brazil at one point, I'm not sure right now, but they tried to like kind of reinvent their military, but by having it participate in peacekeeping missions, if anything like solidarity missions, like sending people to Haiti and stuff like that. I don't know. I wouldn't write off the military. There's a lot of positive things about a military. Like it could be very equalizing, can be empowering, especially for lower income people, especially for immigrants. I mean, that's the U.S. experience. But I don't know. I guess I'm curious. What do you mean by military? What's the talk about military spending? Like, is it? I mean, it's another thing if you're just building nuclear weapons and stockpiling them somewhere. But military can also be a site for technological advancement, developing satellites and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, internet.
Yeah, the internet is so great. We all love it. Yes, well, again, there's a particular German dimension to it, right? So we have had bad experiences with that. And people are obviously worried. And this is something that Ukraine is much closer to the United States. Yes, it is. To Germany than to the United States, right? So people here are more concerned about an escalation of this conflict, though I don't think that's necessarily the case. But the question obviously is, if you need to have a strong military to be an export nation, and if you therefore need to accept that there will be ecological consequences, and if you need to, then the question is, do we want to be an export nation, and is there an alternative to that? And then we're back at the net growth question, right? But yeah, I was thinking that you were going to make a more positive argument for it, Anthony, but you totally disappointed. Sorry for the net growth argument. But yes, Jason, basically the question is like, it sounds like being an export nation is a pretty nasty thing. Maybe could we change this, and shouldn't we change it?
I mean, like, again, like, this is a decision, right? To be an export-driven economy, like, it was a decision made in World War II, because you basically destroyed your entire industrial base. You were like, okay, well, we obviously can't have a consumption-driven economy because nobody has anything. And America opened its markets, and you said, all right, we're going to export to America. You've continued to do this. In the specific, like, one thing that's been kind of striking to me, or at least, like, in the sort of like the article I wrote, like that one specific graph that shows kind of like German income versus like German GDP, like it's like there's a huge divergence, whereas in France and the US it's largely the same. Like, and that's a specific decision. You've decided upon like financial repression. You've decided to basically say, like, we are going to keep, in order to be competitive, we are going to keep our wages by hook or by crook. We're going to keep our wages low relative to the productivity of our workers. And that has costs. One is that, like, yeah, you are dependent on this sort of like, are the existing system still working? Right? If Trump wins, good luck. Like, you are dealing with the fact that China is slowing down and is also moving into territories. It's one thing when China's making rubber duckies, right? It's another thing when China starts making like EVs that are competitive or, beyond the ability to, or even German companies to compete. And you are relying on the fact that, like, you're relying on your customers letting you do business there. I think Volkswagen continues to believe that, like, they will maintain significant market share in China. I'm significantly more skeptical about that. Just because, not only because of subsidies, but also because, frankly, the product offerings are superior right now. Like, the Chinese make better EVs, and they're cheaper. And yeah,
I have a question about actually that disparity, which I find crazy. Right? How is this something that is possible? And everybody's okay with it? Is it because nobody knows that that wages are depressed artificially?
It's because it's hard to compare it to. It's hard to compare it to a counterfactual, right? Because it's like you're effectively saying that, like, well, what would my theoretical wages be if, like, everything were open, right? Like, it's just like you're comparing to a theoretical. Like, so for the average voter, what?
I was like, how in Germany are people complaining about wages? What were salaries? Is this something that people in Germany? Is this a complicated discussion? Yeah, I mean, I say that because I think comparing from the U.S. perspective and a European perspective, I don't know if it's a German perspective, honestly. Because, like, when I talk to my French friends, they say to me regularly, they're like, we don't talk about wages like you do because we have so much stuff is decommodified in Europe, and so because there's such so it's just a different conversation.
Yeah.
We're obsessed about making money because we have to pay for so much stuff in the U.S.
But Japan and China are good examples too, right? Like, if you look at sort of like, they both followed the export-driven model at the same time. So does South Korea as well. Like, and functionally, again, like, because they were coming from such an absolute low after the war, or World War II in China's case, a little more than that, like the various communist revolutions, like the fact that you're making leaps and bounds, like from an absolute sense, you were getting rich, right? The issue then is that, like, again, like, I guess my worry is that there is one consumer of last resort, right? That is the United States. No other country has the size or scale to absorb all those commodities. If for whatever reason America decides, like, you know what, we're kind of done with this. Like, I don't necessarily know, like, what, like, the correction is going to be. or how
I just want to make a quick point about. Do we talk about wages here? Not really, though. I have to maybe burst that bubble a little bit as well. People here are talking a lot about the massive costs that the welfare state is increasingly putting on them individually. Like health insurance is huge. It's a huge part of that's taking out of your paycheck. Generally, commodities are very expensive, but the welfare state is, and this is going to be a fun one that I want to do down the road as well, right? The welfare state was kind of a neat idea, but it also has a structural problem that's kind of unsolvable. It becomes more and more expensive. Services are coming worse and worse, and people are like, why am I paying like $600, $700, $800 a month, and I have public insurance, not private? Right? And people who pay for private don't get the service that you would think you get with private insurance either. So there's a whole big, huge, and actually, you know who talked about this? Jürgen Habermas. A long time ago. He's like, this is the real problem. This is a really interesting conversation we should have. Maybe I write the article for it, but it's his argument for why the left has such a tough time, because this was the argument, that this was sort of the solution, the welfare state, and now it's basically diffused the workers, the clash, and it sort of killed the proletariat, and now we're all living happily in a welfare state, but the welfare state is not delivering. It can't, I think.
Well, the demographics are do not work.
Yeah, I think it might also, everything gets more expensive. All treatments, hospital, all of this. I mean, they're rationalizing. Again, we were just talking about, we had a family emergency, and the one hospital they were discussing when they picked up the person, they were like, are we bringing her there or there? Because depending on which injury she had, she would go there or there. Well, there's not going to be a there or there anymore, because that one hospital is going to be shut down, right? And so that's a whole other problem. And that's an issue, actually, that a lot of, I'm not sure which way is better, the American way or the European way, but it's not as rosy and pretty here as it's sometimes painted in the United States either, right? Sweden is always like fun, and Norway has oil coming out of its ears, so they're paid for everything, and they're very few people, right? Switzerland, very few people. Most other countries, but in Germany, 80 million people. So, but that's another discussion to be had. So we basically agree that net growth would be nice, but seems difficult to pull off.
I don't quite get, I think the growth, it seems to me, I'm not an economist, and I'm not, especially a post-1980s economist. I'm not a Chicago school person. It seems to me it seems like smoke and mirrors, like a lot of math, a lot of stats. I think like Chinese growth, I wonder how much of that is simply people moving into areas that now they have their life choices measured. So much, like I talked to my colleagues at the university about this, like people move into cities, and when you move into cities, everything you do is counted and tracked. I grew up on a farm, and a lot of things that we did, we never kept track of. We never measured. We were still participating in the economy, but we had milk, we milked cows, we drank that milk. It fell out totally outside the economy. We raised grain, we fed it to the cows. Again, something else totally left out of the economy. If we'd have sold that stuff, that counts now as growth, when really it's not. We were just doing what we've been doing, and it's counted. So I don't know. I think there's a mystery of growth, a fetish around growth. I mean, and we can talk about exports. U.S. is an export economy too, especially in egg, right? 1 out of every 4 rows of corn is sent, or soy is sent abroad. And I don't know if that's sustainable, but so I don't know. The growth stuff, I guess it's like growth for who, for what? I don't know. It's tough. It's like, I just don't. And you take it all in the aggregate, it doesn't mean anything to me.
I'd say China specifically is a weird case because it's like, one is like GDP in most countries is an output, right? You try to measure all this stuff. In China, it's more of an input. Wherein like sort of like government says, we're hitting 5% growth. I don't care how you do it exactly, whether it's building infrastructure, whether it's building real estate, you're going to hit 5% growth. Like it's a target to hit. The other point is like, as far as like rural urban divide, there's like a weirdness in sort of like how they calculate stats because of the Hupo system. I don't want to kind of get into the details here, but like just as one example, for example, like as a rural person, you could never be unemployed. Because as a rural person, if you're ever unemployed, you can just be a farmer. So you never count towards the unemployment stats. But anyways, that's like, yeah, like that's China just is its own system. That's different from how things are done and measured in the West, which is what sometimes in a sense it's comparing apples and oranges. But yeah, I mean, the global South is going to want to continue to grow. There's just no way around it. From an equity point of view, the argument is like, wait a minute, how come like the West gets to grow rich, and to do all this industrialization, but now you're telling us we have to kind of like, pay all these, because like they can't afford the capital to build all this green infrastructure, right? It's got to come from somewhere. It's got to come from us. It's got to come from the developed nations. Like, and I suspect it would be a hard push for the Scholz government to push for like cutting huge checks to develop green tech to.
I think it's a question of framing and going back to language and conversation and so on. Because I think if you speak to someone in Brazil, if you say growth, they're going to say, yes, we want growth. And actually some of the 1970s arguments against, or I should say exactly what you said, Jason, was like stuff, I think it was like, I forget who it was, in the military government in Brazil. They were saying, you all bulldozed your forests in the United States. Now you want us to preserve the Amazon? That's ridiculous. We want to grow, but I wonder if you frame it differently. If it's like, I don't know if it's necessarily about like destroying things, but the way that it's framed, the way that we're having this conversation, it needs to change in terms of how we think about growth and prioritize different things. Value. The question of value here is also like what has to be discussed. So
I mean, that's the Chinese argument behind the BRI, right? They basically say we are going to develop your infrastructure. We have all the green tech. We're going to give you all this Chinese green tech, right? Because we have the solar panels, right? It's so cheap. We use them as fences. Like we will, we're going to pay for it. We're going to do all this stuff. While as the West just keeps on lecturing you about human rights, on worker rights, on LGBT rights, right? We're just going to give you the solar panels. We're going to build it out. We're going to have no questions asked. And that's the pitch, right? That frankly is not an area where the West can compete, both because of yes, we have our own constraints, but also because like Germany doesn't produce solar panels. Like it would have to buy them from China. So there's no edge there for there's basically, so I think the discussion is happening, but we're not in charge of it.
All right. Well, at least we're having the discussion, and I think that's more than most people can already say. But so it still seems to come down in the end to someone being able to make the tough calls and maybe putting it bluntly to the populace what the options are. And we'll see. Friedrich Merz was just crowned to be the candidate for the Conservative Party. He has a history at BlackRock, so there's that option. I'm not sure. I don't think that the AfD necessarily has the answers to these issues, or that they're fundamentally better capable of making those tough calls. So we'll see, but I, in my opinion, something needs to happen. I want to thank you both for having this conversation, taking the time. We're almost reaching 2 hours now. But I think this was really, really interesting. A very good conversation that one should continue, and maybe those of you who have watched the whole thing or part of it will continue this conversation. I hope you do. I also want to thank Peter Bach for his comments. I want to encourage all of you to do the same in the future. Send us your comments. Praise is always also appreciated. We got lots of praise for that. So thanks to also Jason for writing a really entertaining, interesting, provocative article. I think we're really on a good track. Anthony we're working on a piece with on another article there. So we have another big election coming up. This time, well, there's a tiny one in Germany in the state of Brandenburg, but the big one is coming up in the United States. Sonia and I will actually be there. It looks like we'll be in New York City. Maybe we'll even watch it with Jason that evening. So, and yeah, thank you both. And we'll see you again during the next forum.